Hi everyone, so we're at the end of week 6 for our class, which means you only have one more unit to go, unit 7, before we're entirely wrapped up with the course and you guys are good to go, hopefully with a lot more knowledge of American history than you had previously. Just so for a few basic reminders about the end of the course, you still will have to do the usual assignments for unit 7 next week. You still have your usual post due by Thursday night and then response post due by Sunday night. So just keep that in mind since the final will also be open. Same deal as it was with the midterm. You just need to do 2 things for that week. The final will be open Saturday, the 21st, so in like tomorrow, Saturday. And it will be open until all the way through the end of the day on Sunday the 29th. So that gives you over an entire week to complete the final. It's the same format, same time limit as your midterm, so there shouldn't be any surprises there. Earlier this week, I posted your study guide for it, so you guys should have hopefully a good idea of what you need to really be focusing on to do well. And if you have any more specific questions about what to expect beyond what's on the study guide, then as always, feel free to email me. So we're at the what most people consider sort of the most exciting part of the class, right? We're getting to the secession crisis. We're looking at the years leading up to the Civil War. We're looking at a lot of really dramatic things going on in American history. So when I was looking over your posts for this week and last week, this even started to come up, a few of you guys have been mentioning this idea of how the parties are so different from now, or when did the parties switch, and those sorts of questions. Like, how do these parties that we're studying in the 1840s, 50s, 60s relate, if at all, to the political parties that we're all pretty much familiar with today, right, the Republicans and the Democrats? So for the wrap-up video this week, I thought that I would just go over this with you really briefly, because one thing it's actually really important to know, and just in terms of understanding the history of political parties in the United States, they are, as we all know, very important, right? The country is very partisan. Sometimes this is talked about as being, particularly damaging. Sometimes it's talked about as being central to democracy, right? This idea that we can have different ideologies, different parties existing peacefully together in the same country. So lots of opinions on both sides about political parties. So this is one of the most helpful things to know about the course, right? It might actually come up later in your life that you can be like, well, this is when, the modern-day Republicans emerged, or this is how the Democrats got to be that they were today, which is a little bit more likely that you'll want to discuss that with someone than it is, for instance, like what the era of good feelings meant, which is perhaps less likely to come up in social conversations or in the work that you do for the rest of your life. So we will do that really briefly because I get when I'm teaching, this is often a question that I and my other colleagues who teach American history often come up once we start getting into, the 20s and 30s when we get the Democrats, and later we'll be seeing the emergence of the Republican Party. We recognize these terms, right, because they are the same names as the parties today, and it's sort of this natural question of, well, what's changed? How did we get to where we are today? So just real briefly, there are about 6 phases in American history where we can identify specific two-party systems. The United States, from the beginning, has largely been dominated by a two-party system. There's really never been a time where there was a competitive third party, if you look through electoral maps. A little bit in the early 19th century and mid-20th century, or mid-19th century, sort of, but largely every time one party falls out of favor, another comes to take its place, thus sort of retaining the two-party system. So the first we've already talked about at length in this class, and that's from the beginning of the nation, we have the Federalists and what become the Democratic Republicans, right? Remember, the Federalists are led largely by Alexander Hamilton, who is promoting particularly this idea of a big bank, and the Democratic Republicans, led largely by Jefferson and Madison, who say, no, land is more important, small farmers are more important, those are who should be really represented by government, not the wealthy, not the people with banking power, for instance, as Hamilton cares about. So this gets us through 1792 to about the 1820s. We get in the middle there, there's this period where there's not a lot of political contention after the Federalists die out. We have, of course, James Monroe and the era of good feelings, which a lot of you guys wrote about in the last week, how this seems to be one of the lesser polarized periods in American history. That all changes for the election of 1828, when we get Andrew Jackson. By the election of 1828, it's clear that the Democratic Republicans, who had enjoyed this period of not having a lot of competition, were splitting, and there was a debate about what direction the party should go in. Because Andrew Jackson is successful in the election of 1828, he gets to decide essentially which way the party goes, and they become known as the Jacksonian Democrats. So that's where we get the term Democrats, and the modern-day Democratic Party does trace its founding back to that election and Jackson. At the same time, we also see the Democratic Republicans fading. The Republican name gets sort of dropped off, and we actually get this new party called the Whigs, who are very, very interesting because they're fairly short-lived, but also quite important. They are probably the only more important third party in American history, but they're not really a third party in this context. They're really just competing with the Democrats, so it's not really the same thing. So the big problem with the Whigs is, well, they are more in favor of, so the big issues during Jackson and the Whig debates are the spoil system, which Jackson is a big fan of, and the National Bank, which Jackson is not a big fan of. And he makes sure that the National Bank does not happen, as you guys have all read about by now, hopefully. So the Whigs are more in favor of limiting the power of the presidency, and so in order to promote that, they run on this idea that Jackson has abused the office of the presidency, essentially, and he's making the executive branch too strong. The Whigs champion this idea that Congress should be a very substantial check on the actions of the president. In his re-election year in 1832, the Whigs specifically put out a propaganda campaign calling Jackson King Andrew because they want to associate him with monarchy, with having too much power. This doesn't work because Andrew does get elected in 32. But it is, again, this idea of how much power should the federal government have or not have. But the issues are very different, right? The bank, the spoil system, and as we move into the next few years, tariffs are a huge part of the political platforms as well. So that gets us through about 1850, because the Whigs run into a problem with the Compromise of 1850 that we've talked about. The Whigs can't decide what to do about slavery, and this is, that's really their issue. They don't have any leaders that come out into the 50s to sort of lead the charge and say, this is what we should do about slavery, this is not what we should do about slavery. And so that's a lot of the problem. This is where the Republicans enter the picture. They largely pick up the fragmented pile that is the Whig Party, and they refurbish it essentially into something that will go over with a more consistent constituency that will help them get elected, unlike the Whigs. So that gets us to the modern-day Republican Party. This is why, you know, the Republican Party today does still sometimes call itself the Party of Lincoln. It is, the names have not changed anything since then. But the constituencies really have. The demographics of who's in which party has changed substantially over the year. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit here. So, in the election of 1860, as you guys will read this week and next week, Lincoln is elected, and if you look at the electoral map of 1860, you'll realize that Lincoln doesn't win any state in the South. He wins entirely on the North, and what the South decides to do in 1860 is that basically they choose to not recognize that Lincoln was actually elected president because no one from the South elected him, so how could he be the South president? So they secede. A handful of states secede. And then later, more secede. And that's what gets to the Civil War. That's what gets us to the founding of the Confederacy. This is the major realignment here because from the Civil War on, the Republican Party is known as sort of the party of Lincoln, and therefore the party that assimilates the freedmen, the freed slaves, into the party after the Civil War concludes. And there's a brief period where former slaves are granted voting rights, and they're able to actually exercise the right to vote in the North and even in the South, briefly during Reconstruction. So that's a big realignment. That's a big new group that had not previously had access to the vote, and they joined the Republican Party. From the 1860s on, really through the 1890s, the Republican-Democrat divide is defined by slavery. The Democrats in the South, once the Civil War is over and they're working on reintegrating into the Union, the Democrats continue to form their agenda around the idea that former slaves, freedmen, should not have political rights, shouldn't be able to hold office. They passed a series of legislation called the Black Codes, largely limiting the political rights that free slaves were supposed to have as a result of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So Democrats do all that they can to really limit the effects of Reconstruction, while the Republicans continue to champion, for the most part, protecting those rights that were given by these new amendments. So that's a lot to change, even just within, honestly, 30 or 40 years. That's a really short time period, and it's a really important one, especially in terms of your final. So you're going to want to understand the development of the party system from Jackson to Lincoln's election. So that gets us to about the fourth political party system era, from about 1896, when McKinley was elected, to the 1930s. The election of 1896 has a lot to do with the Panic of 1893, which is at the time was probably the most devastating economic crisis for the United States to have gone through at that point, and the Democrats are largely blamed for it. So that is a bummer on them, and they spend the next several election cycles not really being able to come back from that defeat. In the early 1900s, the Republican Party is known as the Party of Reform. They do a lot of social welfare initiatives in terms of child labor, job safety, food safety, anything modern, really, professionalization, infrastructure. Those are all things associated with the Republican Party in the Progressive era in the early 1900s. Republicans have it good until the Great Depression happens in 1929. Because the Republicans were in office when this happens, it's really difficult for them to escape the blame for that particular situation. That gets us to the fifth political party system of about the 1930s. 1933 particularly is an important year because FDR is elected in 1932, and he really changes who was voting for who at this time, right? Previously to this, we saw Republicans having African Americans, businessmen, shop owners, craftsmen, and any sort of professional field were likely to be Republican, especially in the North. Democrats at this time were still considered redeemers, although they also did have small groups, some smaller Southern business owners, and Catholic immigrants who become an incredibly important force from about 1850 onwards. They're a very big constituency for the Democratic Party. But back to the 1930s. So we have FDR. FDR assembles what is called the New Deal Coalition in the election of 1933, 1932. And it's significant for several reasons. One of the biggest ones being that this is the election where Democrats are able to gain a majority of African Americans to vote for the Democrats, and thus that's a huge party demographic shift. And it remains to today, right? African Americans are essentially the most consistently voting Democratic group in the country, and they remain key to the partisan politics of today. So the New Deal Coalition is a lot around African Americans, and it really changes who is on what side of the divide there. So there's debated whether there's a sixth political party system that emerges essentially in the 60s and 70s, the Reagan coalition, sometimes what it's called, or the moral majority or the silent majority under Reagan and Nixon. But that's so recent that historians just kind of say, well, that's too recent to really make any conclusions about. But it is, of course, there was significant shifts there as well. So that's just a really brief overview of the parties. And it's important to know when you guys, when your friends is like, so when did the Republican and Democratic Party switch? When did the Republicans become conservative, and when did the Democrats become liberal? That's really not how it works. If you're looking at the issues that I just really briefly described to you guys. So much of American politics prior to the New Deal, and even around the New Deal, were about slavery and the legacies of slavery. it's also really important to keep in mind that the constituencies that we have today are nothing like the constituencies that we had even in the 1930s. We pretty much take it for granted today that everybody has the ability to vote in the United States for the most part. That doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of voter intimidation, that there aren't efforts to stop certain groups in certain areas from voting. That's certainly true. But for the most part, under law, everybody's supposed to be able to vote. That's not the case for a lot of American history. Don't forget, women, meaning really white women, were not allowed to vote until the 1920s. That's something that happened, again, only 100 years ago now, just recently. Even after women had the right to vote in the 1920s, black women are still largely excluded from the polls in particular. And freedmen, African Americans, aren't able to vote. Besides the brief period of Reconstruction where they had easier access to the polls, there was sort of legally enforced protection to escort freedmen to the polls without getting lynched or beaten, anything like that. But for the most part, before the mid-1900s, it's really a lot of white men that continue to vote. And after 1920s, white women too. So keep that in mind. And again, of course, prior to 1860, remember, prior to 1860, we have about 3 major political party systems, right? The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the split of the Democratic Republicans against the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs, and then the Democratic Republicans around the Civil War era, which were largely split north and south. All of those systems have no black people in them. And again, no women. So that's an incredibly different set of issues, an incredibly different set of people who are deciding who's in government. So, with all those combined, the current party system that we understand in the United States today is so recent that it's really important to contextualize where the parties came from. There was no period when the parties switched. We see the parties emerge over time, slowly for the most part, and different issues come up. The main issue is slavery, which later, again, turns into essentially the civil rights movement. We have questions of tariffs and taxes. We have questions of urban reform, questions of infrastructure, railroads, questions of communication, questions of should a woman be allowed to vote or not before 1920. All sorts of things that are much more complicated and a different set of issues primarily than the issues that we talk about that divide the Democrats and Republicans today. So, the next time someone talks to you about the changing party systems, you guys should be experts in that. Again, obviously for our final, you don't need to know anything past the Civil War. You should have an idea about what happens in Reconstructions. That's covered briefly at the end of your reading. But of course, you most only need to know the first 3 of those political party arrangements. Yes, which is a lot to take in. It's always one more long-winded answers. So I hope that helps you guys give a little bit of context to political parties today because they're always a hot topic. And I will, as usual, have your discussion board post for you, graded by Monday night. And if any questions about the finals, feel free to email me. Make sure that you've gotten through all of the week 6 and week 7 reading before you open the final. Even though it's open earlier, you will need to read Unit 7 before you can really do well on the final, of course. So, congrats on making it to almost the end of the course, and I will talk to you guys within the next week to let you know the logistics of how grading the final is going to go and getting your final grades. So, good luck with this final home stretch, and email me with any questions.